Hello and welcome to this talk entitled Iona, a Thin Place by Ben Cook, Director of Christian Formation, St Andrews Newcastle, where this talk was originally delivered. This talk is about a small Scottish island called Iona, which is a thin place, somewhere where the spiritual world and the physical world meet and can be thin and sometimes transparent almost. Prior to moving to Maine, I lived and worked on Iona, so this is not only the story of a spiritual place, a thin place, but it's also part of my story. So thinking about thin places are something that people have encountered forever. They've always been a part of how people view the world, that there are some places that are just more moving, more spiritual, and where the sense of an other world can be really experienced. Many people talk about this with experiences in nature, with experiences on mountaintops. That's particularly a context that we find in biblical narratives. This image here by William Blake depicts a story found in Genesis 28, where Jacob lies his head down and dreams of a ladder that ascends to heaven. And on this ladder he sees angels going up and down, ascending and descending to heaven. When he wakes up in the morning, Jacob is amazed. He says, "Surely this is the gates of heaven," and picks up the stone, sets it up, and praises God for the experience that he's had there. And this is somewhere that he returns to again, that he expects to have these experiences of encountering the divine. And Iona, the small Scottish island I used to live on, is kind of like that. It's a place where you have these encounters, where you have these experiences. This image of the ladder of divine ascent, this image of a ladder that Jacob sees, is one that gets picked up on by early Christians and is used as a model or a metaphor. John Cashin, an early monastic monk living in a desert, draws on this story to describe what moral perfection looks like, what it looks like to live the Christian life. And this icon here from Mount Sinai shows the ladder of divine ascent. You can see that there's lots of bishops, priests, monks, and ordinary people climbing up this ladder. In the top left-hand corner, you see the angels cheering them on. And the top right-hand corner, at the top of the ladder, is Jesus. And just below Jesus is, of course, the guy who commissioned the icons. Here are the demons pulling people off, hitting them with hammers, shooting them with arrows, and dragging them down into the fires of hell. Because thin places are not just places where your encounter with divine can be stronger. There are also places where your encounter with things that are hard can be much harder. There are places where the spiritual, both good and bad, is much stronger. So this is something that monks used to be aware of. It was part of the idea of the desert experience, that you were going to have trials, you were going to have tribulations. And this is something that comes into play with Iona. And when Iona was originally founded as a Christian settlement, as a Christian place, monks were there to be in a desert. So here it is. It's the island desert. This is a nice image of the map, Iona, past and present by the Richies. It's somewhere that really evokes a lot of creativity. So let's go onto a map and put it for us. Here is Maine, where we are, or where I am, and here is Iona in the UK. So it's right the way across the other side of the Atlantic. If you take a look at the map here, this gives you a good sense of the latitudes. Iona is on roughly the same latitude as the Hudson Bay or St. Petersburg in Russia. So it's somewhere that gets extremely long days in the summer and extremely short days in the winter, somewhere with extremes of light and of dark. So let's get a little closer. Here is the UK. You can see in the sort of middle of Britain there's a city called Birmingham. That's where I'm from. And our arrow here is pointing to Iona. Iona is quite remote. You can see that there aren't many cities around it. There's not much that's named. As the crow flies, you are closer to Northern Ireland and Belfast than you are to Glasgow. It's actually a lot harder to get to bits of mainland Scotland than it is if you've got a boat to get to Ireland. So there is a close-up. The island next to it is called Mull. You can see it says Isle of Mull. If you're wanting to get to Iona, you have to go all the way to Oban on the right-hand side there, take a train or a bus or drive there from Glasgow, and then travel across to Mull, cross Mull, take another ferry, and then you get to Iona. So it is really very remote. To get there from where I grew up in Birmingham took over a day's travel, and that's not a long distance, but it is a long travel. Here's our close-up on the island itself, Iona. You can see that there's the ferry crossing as a dotted line there. It really is kind of the end of the road. If you keep going from here, next thing you hit is Canada. So very, very much out there. Iona is a small island. It's about 3 miles long by about 1 mile wide at the greatest extent in the middle. The north end of the island is dominated by the largest hill on the island called Dunny, and the south end of the island, which you can see here is that kind of darker, browner colour, is mostly kind of upland. It's very moor, a lot of bog, a lot of sheep grazing. There isn't much habitation down there. People don't live in the southern end of the island. People tend to live through the middle, which is the brighter green colours on this. They're mostly on the east side. Big weather comes in from the west, blowing off the Atlantic, so you don't really want to be on that side of the island. So they live on the east side, towards Mull, towards the mainland, and out of the way of those big storms. There's lots of sheep grazing here, lots of fishing as part of the life traditionally, and there's also cattle. But really the main industry on the island is tourism now. Mostly it's people coming to visit there. So in order to get there, you have to take your ferry trip all the way to Mull. These are the ferries on Mull. Note how big they are. They're not huge transatlantic ferries. They're not like the ones that ferry people across the English Channel. They are relatively small, but still big. When you get to Iona, you get on a really tiny ferry that'll fit 2 cars, and it will go out in just about any weather. You can see here this is pretty choppy seas. They will be out in really stormy seas to try and keep that connection open and keep the people on the island connected. This gives you an introduction as well to the landscape. You can see that there isn't a lot here other than rocks and short cropped heather. This here is the view you get from the ferry though. Looking up from the harbour and heading up towards Bishop's House in the foreground, and then in the background you can see the Abbey. Iona Abbey is kind of the main tourist attraction that people come for. And again, you can see there's very few trees here, very few bushes. It's very open, very exposed, very rocky. So even the kind of physical sense of the place is somewhere that's thin. There isn't much there. It's like bare rock, bare sky, bare sea. Really intense landscape. Most people on Iona live in the village. This here is the village. On the right you can see the houses. Many of these are 2 or 3 room properties. They're very small. But people really value being able to live on the island and being present there. It's somewhere that people really love to be. When you walk up from the village towards the Abbey from the ferry, this is what you see. For most people, this is their sense of what the thin place on Iona is all about. It's all about a spiritual place that has been significant to the Scottish Church for a very, very long time. Originally, Iona was settled by kind of local Picts, and then later by Irish colonists who came over. And in the 500s, it became a hub for missionary work. When Columba came to Iona, he was an exiled monk from Ireland. He got kicked out of Ireland over a copyright argument. He copied someone else's Psalter, and the guy wanted it back. He said no, and this caused a big fight, as in a war kind of fight, where quite a lot of people died, and so he was exiled over copyright issues. And he came to this outpost of Irish settlement off the west coast of Scotland, and from there he travelled all over Scotland and converted many of the local chiefs and became the missionary to the Scots. So this really was a sort of significant, important place. The Abbey that we see here today, you can see it here, it's got scaffolding on it, it's constantly being reworked and repaired. A lot of people think this is the traditional original Abbey of Columba, but actually this is a reconstruction of a later medieval monastery that stands on the site of Columba's monastery. If we come around to the other side of it, here's the front. So it's a wonderful, beautiful looking complex. The Abbey Church on the right was rebuilt in the late 1800s, and the buildings on the left are all later construction. In fact, some of them weren't finished until the 1970s. So they're later rebuilds of the medieval monastery. Originally, though, this would have been the site where Columba and his monks were. The vision to rebuild this and to revitalize this place that was in ruins as a site for the church in Scotland came through George MacLeod, who in the 1930s really pushed for unemployed workmen to have employment, and he sought to provide them employment by getting them rebuilding stuff alongside seminary students. He was a Church of Scotland minister in Glasgow, and originally they rebuilt an old watermill. And the experiment of bringing together seminarians who were learning to serve communities and unemployed workmen and having them live together in community while they did a construction project was so successful, he decided to bring them out to the small island off the west coast of Scotland that was very remote and have them rebuild the abbey. So you can see here, this is what it looked like before any of the reconstruction work started. They were ruthless buildings that had been abandoned since the Reformation. And so he really wanted to reinvigorate this. And the end result of bringing together seminarians and craftsmen was that the seminarians learned to do some work and the craftsmen learnt to celebrate. And they created a very unique and very dynamic liturgy that is still used today on the island and continues to evolve and draw in new elements. So here's Columba. Columba is often depicted as having a dove on his shoulder. His name in Irish is Columcille, the dove of the church. And this is a engraving picture of a statue that's on the back of Bishop's house. So here he is looking very grand, being very missionary and drawing people to the island. The original pieces that we still have from his day on the island, his monastery would have been wattle and daub, it would have been wood and has not survived. What we do have, though, are the preaching crosses from the early medieval period, that kind of late antiquity period, the 700s. These preaching crosses were erected all over Scotland, and they were used by the early missionaries as a way of drawing people together. They would turn up in a town, put up a cross, have everyone come round it, and then they tell stories about the life of the church. And this one here is one of the oldest ones in Scotland. This is the St Martin's cross, and it's really quite beautiful and stands in front of the abbey, even now, 1,000 years after it was originally put up. This one here is the St John's cross. It's a replica of the original. The arms fell off it, so they made a concrete replica, and they've stuck the original in a museum to keep it safe. But this is another example of these preaching crosses. They got very dynamic, and if you think about the Celtic cross with the cross and then that circular shape in the background, this is where that shape comes from. It's because people wanted bigger and more dynamic preaching crosses, and they discovered if you just make the arms on them longer, they fell off. The stone couldn't cope with it, so they added in a circle in the background to provide structural support, and it has subsequently acquired a lot of kind of spiritual meaning. It's very beautiful, and this Celtic cross comes from these big preaching crosses. And yeah. So when you go into the Iona Abbey, this is what you see. Iona Abbey is a very strange place. Normally churches, when you go into them, the church kind of progresses up. The altar and the sacred space is at the very top of the church. But in the Iona Abbey, everything kind of sinks down. And you go down to the altar from the entrance, which is very different. So it's a medieval church. It's not huge, it's entirely granite, it is always cold in there whatever time of year it is, and it's freezing if you're there in the winter. And it really is a thin place in the sense of that spiritual conflict. Some of the most amazing services I've ever attended have been in this church, and some of the scariest, most dangerous spiritual experiences I've had have also been in this church. It is a place where the battle between good and evil, between heaven and hell, seems real and present because it is. Thin places cut both ways, and the Abbey Church is not really kind of out of that. It's definitely part of that experience. So for me, although this was a great place, it was not somewhere that I felt was the most spiritual part of being on Iona. It wasn't the most spiritual part of being in the Abbey. I felt much more at home in the cloisters. The cloisters for medieval abbeys were the place where the community life, where the outside world of the community and the spiritual life, that is the life of the monks inside, all kind of came together. And for the Iona community, that continues to be the case. They have guests who come and stay in the abbey. They have members of the public who come and worship in the church, and they have staff, residents and volunteers who are there for a period of time to live and work and represent the Iona community. And they all meet there. You can see in this picture that this is a bunch of different people from different walks of life and from different parts of the community, all gathering together to have a go at creating something in this community space. And it's very true to the traditions of cloisters. Cloisters were the places where monks could walk and see guests, and they could meet with others. It was the place where the community came together, both public and private space together. The cloisters have some beautiful statuary around them. Chris Hall was the principal carver of these, and as you go round the cloisters on each side, one side has flowers from the UK. This one here features the thistle, which is the symbol of Scotland, and the rose, which is the symbol of England. Not always friendly people, but here they are together in peace. There's also flowers from the Holy Land, flowers that are traditional to the area. And there's also sculptures of local birds on some of these capitals around the cloisters. So when they rebuilt it, they didn't just want the abbey to be a place that captured something of their time. They wanted it to capture something more than that, the spiritual meaning of this place. You can see here, this is an unusual angle on the cloisters. You can see there in the center there's a statue that's a replica of, well, it's another second cast of a statue that's originally for a monastery in Los Angeles. So it's a piece of American art here in a Scottish monastery. And you'll see that in the center of that, there's the dove descending, and in the middle is Mary. And she's got her arms open. She's welcoming people in. This is one of the more controversial works of art in Iona. Some people really love it. I happen to really like it. Some people really hate it and think it's terrible. No one seems to have middle ground on it, though. It's definitely something that brings out the passions in people, which is also part of Thin Places. You either like it or you don't. So on the opposite side of the cloisters from the Abbey Church is the refectory. So the cloisters is the place where the public and private meet, is also the place between being fed physically and being fed spiritually. This here is the refectory in Iona Abbey. The long tables here are where guests eat. Meals are always communal there, so you eat with guests, residents, and visitors to the island who are all there together. They all will eat at a table and will have a chance to visit. When you're working there as a volunteer or a resident, you get used to being asked the kind of standard questions. How long have you been here? How did you first hear about Iona? How long are you going to be here? What are you doing? And you get very good at deflecting some of those questions and trying to ask people back for some more meaningful input on why they're on the island, what their spiritual experience is looking like. But it's also a place where traditionally monks would have had spiritual reading. They'd have had to do their meals in silence. That's not how the Iona community does their meals. They are not silent. But it is a place where that encounter with the spiritual continues in the life of community together. Yeah. So for many people, trying to find the thin place, trying to find the spiritual in Iona involves going beyond the abbey. It involves going out and walking the island. The island itself is somewhere that's very beautiful, and getting beyond those places where you might be confined, you often find more or different spiritual encounters and spiritual meanings. So for some people, some of the other churches on the island are the places where they find spiritual encounter. This is the Oran Chapel. It's the oldest church on the island. It's named after St Oran, who was one of Columba's original monks. And it's now used quite frequently. There's a group of Orthodox pilgrims who come to the island every year, and they hold services in there, which is really interesting to see. It's also the starting place for many of the different kind of services that people will do. And around it, you can see in the background there on the far right-hand side of this photo, you can see a gravestone, and again on the far left, you can see a gravestone. The Oran Chapel sits in the middle of the island graveyard, and this is where islanders are buried. If you want to be buried on Iona, you have to be born on Iona. Your birth certificate has to say you're from there. You can't be buried there if you're from anywhere else. It's really the island's graveyard. And part of the reason they feel so protective of it is that this was also a royal graveyard for a long time. There are a bunch of kings of Scotland who are buried on Iona, and they are buried in this graveyard somewhere around this chapel. The most famous of all the kings that's buried there is Macbeth, of Shakespearean play fame. No one really knows where Macbeth is buried, and one of the best things about living on Iona is getting to tell tourists where he is buried and pointing to a different spot in the graveyard every week. No one knows where he's buried. He's just in that graveyard somewhere. So also on the island, if you walk around the island, right in the middle of the village is the nunnery. It's really interesting that the abbey, the place where the men were, was kind of out on the outskirts, and it was this big impressive community with this big impressive building that had its own compound that people would go to and kind of set itself apart. Whereas the nuns on the island were living amongst the people. They were right in the village. And the nuns and the nunnery really were part of the hub of the island life. Their chapel on the site there was actually the village church for a long time. It was where the community life happened, and it's really fascinating to me that the women religious who came to this place were the ones who kept the life of the island alive. They looked to the island in a way that they weren't interested in kings, they weren't interested in power, they were more interested in the people who were actually there. And for many people, this is the thin place. This is the spiritual draw that really connects them in, is the community in the place that was created by the nuns on the island. For others, they would prefer to walk out to the far side of the island. This is Hermit Cell. Hermit Cell was originally a monastic retreat spot. If life and community got too much, you could walk out to the far side of the island and spend a couple of days in the cell on your own, away from the rest of the community. And for many people, this is a really important spiritual part of their life on Iona. This photo here does a good job of capturing what being on Iona is like. You can go out in beautiful sunshine, and by the time you reach the other side of the island, it's thick fog and you can't see the views you went to look at. Iona is somewhere where change happens quickly and unexpectedly. And sometimes that is positive, sometimes that is negative, but it is always going to change again. If you're not keen on the weather, wait 10 minutes and whatever storm you're experiencing might blow over. So for others, they prefer to be out walking the island and seeing the views. Iona has some fantastic views. This is looking back up towards Mull, which is really quite beautiful island as well. And others will head towards the south end. If you work your way through all the mud and the mire, you eventually get down to the marble quarry. This group of people here are on the Iona Community's pilgrimage. Every Wednesday they do a guided walk around the island where they take a large group, sometimes as many as 100 people, around the island and stop at various points of spiritual interest, including the marble quarry. So for a long time, the marble quarry extracted Iona marble. The altar there in the abbey is built out of that. There's also various bits of it all over the place. It's a very beautiful kind of white marble with green veins in it. It's a samnite veining in it, and it's literally some of the oldest rock that we found on the planet. So this is a place that really gets to the heart of why this island is so special. It is very unique geologically, it's very unique historically, it's very unique socially. It has done many different things and been many different things to many people. And this is somewhere where you really get that sense of how trying to make this something that commercial doesn't always work. The marble quarry has been closed for a long time. You can see the machinery there, it's all rusted. And even when you find bits of the marks of it, they're not really able to get much more out of it. It's not worth it in terms of the cost of trying to get them out. So this is somewhere where the spiritual experience has to be the thing you take, because there's not much there to be made in terms of money. For others, heading to the far south end of the island, beyond the marble quarry on that pilgrimage, you come to the St Columba's Bay with the Hill of Angels, which is this lump of rock on the right here. It's a little hill that protrudes out. Columba was said to, when he was exiled from Ireland, he sailed around and he had to find a spot where he couldn't see Ireland. He had to be that far away from Ireland in order for his exile to be good. And Iona is literally just beyond the point where you can see Ireland. In fact, on a clear day, you can see Ireland. So he obviously arrived on a foggy day. And he's said to have arrived here and climbed up a mountain and looked out, not seen island anymore, and being like, this is the spot, we're going to stop here. We're as close to island as I can stay and still be keeping my commitment, still be meeting my exile. He's also said to have come back to this spot again to pray, and people saw angels ascending and descending upon him there. Some of his fellow monks who were with him, saw this. So this is a place where that spiritual thin place has been witnessed and experienced. Part of what happens with the Iona pilgrimage when the community brings you there, they ask people to pick up 2 stones and think about something good that they've experienced on Iona that they want to take with them and put that stone in their pocket, and something bad that they want to leave behind, something they want to move beyond, and they take that stone and they throw it into the sea. And then they walk off carrying on their pilgrimage. This is fantastic and wonderful for people who are there on pilgrimage, but for those of us who were there all year round, we got left with all those stones full of bad experiences. And Iona is a place where that stuff swirls around. So it actually was it's kind of interesting that people come there and leave experiences that are tough, and then the local community there has to try and reconcile that. Iona is a really hard place to be through the winter months. It's a really hard place to be even in the summer months. And so part of that is that spiritual experience. Remember that where you see angels, you're liable to see demons. Pilgrimage then continues on to the Maca, which is the raised grazing on the west side of the island. It faces out into the Atlantic. Most of the islands in the Hebrides have a Maca, have this large raised beach where previous storms have washed up lots of sand, and it's all caught up on that side and created large communal grazing areas. And these large communal grazing areas are on sand, they're thin grass, and they're open to any farmer to bring their sheep there. They kind of look like a golf course because you get these blowouts where the sands are, and in fact they are the place where golf was invented. That's where you can go and play a 19-hole golf course on Iona, which loops you backwards and forwards. It also has a sheep hazard, and whatever you do, don't hit Johnny Bull. This was one of my favourite places. I found this a really significant spiritual place. Getting away from the people and having a chance to be out in the wilderness was, the wilder side of things, and see the sea was really important to me. And something that my daughter Teresa, who was born in the Hebrides, born while we lived in the Hebrides, really, really loved as well. She's a big fan of being out there. This is her looking small. She's a lot bigger now. And for us, the other kind of major spiritual place for me on Iona was Bishop's House. Bishop's House is where I used to work. It's the retreat house of the Scottish Episcopal Church, and it was built in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, as a retreat house. You can see here from the side, on the far end of the building are staff accommodation, so on the far left-hand side. In the middle is a chapel, and on the right-hand side is guest lounges. And all the way upstairs is guest accommodation. It sleeps up to 23 guests, and most of the time those are groups that come from churches, although they do run a few weeks every year when individuals can go and stay. Right in the middle of the building is the chapel, inconveniently located with the kitchen on the left and the dining room on the right, with the end result that you have to carry all the food past the front door to it in order to serve a meal. But it's really important for this building that the chapel is in the middle. The house was dedicated to the purposes of prayer, study, and Eucharist, and by putting the chapel squarely in the middle, you can't avoid it. It really becomes the kind of key presence that you experience when you move around the building, that whatever you do, you go past the chapel, whatever you do, you're made aware of the presence of God in that place, in the center of that place. It's a beautiful little chapel, very high Victorian, kind of Anglo-Catholic styling, with some beautiful artwork and some wonderful altar frontals, and all done in the local pink granite. Here it is, looking kind of stripped out. Every Christmas there's a roving carol service, which a different carol is sung in each chapel on the island, and you go around, and there are a lot of churches on the island, so you can work your way around all of them. And it looks particularly good, I think, by candlelight. This was also a place that was very popular for Teresa when she was a baby. This is her invading me, attempting to change the altar frontal and joining in. So on the far end of the house is the study piece of it. This is the library in Bishop's House, a warm, cozy place with a peat fire that really becomes the hub for groups as they're staying there. It becomes the place where they spend a lot of time relaxing and enjoying themselves when they're not out exploring the island or in the chapel worshipping. During the winter time, this becomes the place where folks who are in the house still, the staff who are there all year round, spend a lot of time as well. It's somewhere that becomes their lounge and their place to relax and feel present to everyone who's been there in the past. So for others, the kind of piece that might be their great thin place on Iona is the view. This used to be the view from my kitchen window every morning that I would see. I'd get up in the morning and make a coffee and look at the sunrise and really feel that this was an amazing and special place to be, somewhere where the presence of God could really be known and where the wonders of life could really be felt. And for many people, the privacy of your own view in the Hebrides, that little view from the window, is really significant. One thing that's really striking though with Iona is that it's a place where people come and go a lot. There are thousands of tourists that come through every year. There are hundreds of guests that come and stay on the island, and there's only about 100 people who are there all year round. So it is somewhere where people come and go. These here are little coracles, boats that Columba and the early monks would have used. They're kind of wicker work with a skin on the top that's then tarred. So it's really a very kind of skittish boat. If you don't pull your oars exactly the same, you'll fly off in a different direction. They don't have a keel and they're very hard to steer. And that is really the experience of life in a thin place, that it can be very skittish, it can be pulling in lots of different directions, and you can go from fantastic to terrible in a single day. But whatever happens, whatever your encounters, you don't remain the same. You are changed and constantly on the move through the experiences you have in a place like this. And whatever you do, you should sail on and continue your pilgrim journey into joy, up that ladder towards heaven, and make the most of your times when you come to thin places. Well, thank you very much for watching. For more information about St Andrews and Newcastle and our upcoming services and programs, you can visit our website, www.standrewsnewcastle.org. Until next time, may God bless you.